He is the author of Combating Jihadism, American Hegemony, and the International Cooperation in the War on Terrorism. And his forthcoming book is The Al Qaeda Franchise, The Expansion of Al Qaeda and Its Consequences. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science and the coordinator of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program at Haverford College. Please welcome Barak Mendelsohn to Cambridge.
When you get questions, if you would repeat the question. If not, I'll gently remind you.
No problem. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Though I have to say that now that I know that Dan Byman is coming next week, I'm even more excited that I'm here this week and not having to follow him, because Dan is fantastic. So, one other word, the Al Qaeda franchise came out 2 years ago. My forthcoming book is going to be The Limits of Transnational Jihadism, and this lecture is going to speaks to one of the elements of that new work. So today we're going to speak about the future of Al Qaeda. It seems that recently people are paying attention again to Al Qaeda. And this is relatively new. When bin Laden was killed in early May of 2011, the prevalent claims were that Al Qaeda is over, that all we need is to get a few more of the top-level operatives, which we did in the next following months, and that's it for Al Qaeda. Then came the Arab Uprisings, and the Arab Uprisings seem to suggest that Al Qaeda really failed. Al Qaeda's plan always was based on the assumption that the only way that you can bring about change to the Middle East is through violent means. So for a while, it seemed that Al Qaeda's narrative collapsed, that you can bring about change in the region just by demonstrations in non-violent means. But that didn't happen, and gradually we started seeing that Al Qaeda is taking advantage of opportunities that were open in the Middle East. At the same time, the Islamic State started making noise in Iraq and then in Syria, capturing the attention of the whole world. Again, seemingly Al Qaeda was always in the back and at best not very significant. But then again, Al Qaeda, the Islamic State collapses, at least for a while, and Al Qaeda is now back in business. And now there is a new narrative that suggests that Al Qaeda is resurging. One of the main people to argue that is Bruce Hoffman. And Bruce Hoffman is one of the most important terrorism scholars. So I am glad to come and speak here and to tell you that I think that Hoffman is wrong. As you can see from this slide, lots of people say different things about Al Qaeda. Most of them try to suggest that Al Qaeda is resurging. Just see below the last two people, Dan Byman, that is coming next week, and I think that Cole Bunzel was here already. You see that I still have two people in my camp that suggest that maybe we are exaggerating the importance of Al Qaeda. So first, why do experts have different opinions about the subject? The first issue is just inherent to a clandestine organization. We don't really know the capabilities of Al Qaeda. We have some sense, but there is always some amount of capabilities that is unknown. More than that, when you think about terrorist organizations, since they are trying to use a demonstration of force rather than revealing their whole capabilities, it is hard for us to know what they have in stock beyond the attacks they carried out. So with all those information gaps, it does make sense that people see it differently. But another part of the problem is that people see Al Qaeda or conceptualize Al Qaeda in different ways. For some people, Al Qaeda is just Al Qaeda Central that was in the past on the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and today has some leaders all over the Middle East in addition to the leadership that is in Afghanistan and Pakistan. For others, Al Qaeda is Al Qaeda plus the branches of Al Qaeda. Other people speak about Al Qaeda as a reflection of the whole jihadi movement. So that's another reason why people have different opinions about Al Qaeda. What I'm going to try to do this evening is to make the argument that if we want to understand the power of Al Qaeda, we need to look at the political objectives of Al Qaeda and the problems that a transnational movement like Al Qaeda faces every time that it tries to fight in an international order that is based on states. The tendency in the media and perhaps everywhere that we go is to think about terrorism primarily through the lens of the terrorist activities. You know, we are worried about terrorist attacks, and it seems like all the attention is focused on what do you need to do to prevent terrorist attacks. But to judge the success or the power of terrorist organizations just based on whether they are able to carry out attacks once in a while or on a more regular basis is not enough. The main element should be judging the ability of terrorist organizations to achieve their political objectives. Terrorism doesn't happen just because you have some violent people that want to wreak havoc on civilians. It happens because you have a group of people with grievances and a political agenda that they try to promote through violent means. And so to look only at whether they succeeded in carrying out attacks and how much we managed to prevent those attacks is just not going to be enough. There is an old saying that suggests that terrorists need to succeed only once. Security services could prevent 99 attacks, but it's enough that one will slip through the cracks that it will create an image of success and power for the terrorist organization. I argue that we need to keep in mind that there are political objectives, and those political objectives make it extremely hard for a group like Al Qaeda to succeed, simply because those political objectives are just so tremendous that it's just unrealistic. And in the book that that is going to come out in September, I'm trying to look at 3 different aspects that suggest why transnational jihadism is suffering. One of them focuses on the attraction to national identity, and that's going to be the focus of what I'm going to say today. The other chapter speaks about the operational limits of a transnational group. Because remember, a transnational group with a transnational agenda wants to create effects across borders. It's not enough that you can bring about change in one country and then in another country that have no connection between them. For a group like Al Qaeda, a transnational group, to succeed, they need to be able to have strategic effects across borders. And finally, the last element of that book is going to speak about the internal conflicts within the jihadi movement. But as I said, today I'm going to focus on the first element, and that would be the power of national identities. Or to put it differently, I look at the struggle of Al Qaeda as a clash between transnationalism and an international system that is based on states. My argument is going to be that if we want to understand how strong or weak Al Qaeda is, it's not enough to look at Al Qaeda Central or to just aggregate the capabilities of Al Qaeda Central and all its franchises. What we need to do is also look at the relationships between the core of Al Qaeda and the different branches. And I'm going to try to show in this talk how the branches that are focused on localized jihads are actually undermining the attainment of Al Qaeda's strategic goals, transnational goals. So I will try to show how when Al Qaeda tried to survive after 9/11 by starting franchises across the Middle East, Al Qaeda lost an important element of its transnational agenda. And that effort to survive through localization undermined the pursuit of Al Qaeda's strategic goals. So let's start. So first, what is a franchise? When I speak about a franchise, I speak about a system of two tiers. At the upper tier, you have Al Qaeda Central. This is the central leadership that is supposed to set strategic direction for all the branches, for all the organization to pursue. Below that, you have the franchises or the branches, each in a different location, each responsible for its own arena. A group can become a franchise in two ways. We have two types of franchises. We have franchises in which Al Qaeda, a cadre of Al Qaeda operatives in a certain location declare themselves as a branch, as we saw in Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in the case of that group in Saudi Arabia, later on the same branch in Yemen. And then you have most of the cases in which jihadi groups decide to join Al Qaeda, reach an agreement with Al Qaeda, pledge their loyalty to the leader of Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda in return accept that pledge of allegiance, that bay'ah. So these are two different kinds of arrangements. And I think it makes sense that for Al Qaeda Central, it is much easier to deal with those in-house expansions, in-house branches, since these are people that Al Qaeda knows really well, than to have to deal with the franchises. And when you look at the different cases of Al Qaeda's expansion, you will see what I mean. So Al Qaeda begins expanding in 2003, starting in Saudi Arabia with a branch that was not ready. And in fact, in my book, The Al Qaeda Franchise, I try to argue that it's not even clear that Al Qaeda made the decision to start a franchise. What happened was that the war in Iraq started, and Al Qaeda didn't have people in Iraq, didn't have at least enough people. So that conflict that it always hoped for, bringing the United States into the heart of the Middle East, was going to happen, and Al Qaeda doesn't really have any significant presence in Iraq that could fight the American forces. So Al Qaeda issues instructions to its people in Saudi Arabia and tells them to start operating. The leadership in Saudi Arabia is telling them, we're not ready. But bin Laden insists, and so in May of 2003, about 2 months after the American invasion of Iraq, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula carries out several attacks. Those attacks lead to such a backlash from the Saudi population, and they force the Saudi regime to take a much harsher stance on Al Qaeda. And before anybody knows what's going on, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula loses most of its leadership. The main leader that in few months before the first attack told bin Laden we're not ready, a month after the attack is already dead. Two other leaders that succeeded him are dead in the next couple of months. And then something surprising happens. Around the fall of 2003, suddenly that group of Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, at this stage still without a name, is starting to release some media products, some magazines. One mostly political, another focuses on advice how to carry out attacks. But more importantly, they now release a statement ensigning Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So my argument is that since I couldn't find any evidence that Al Qaeda actually thought about starting a franchise system, was that these things just happened. And suddenly Al Qaeda found itself with a branch in Saudi Arabia and decided to adopt that as a model for the future. So Al Qaeda begins with that branch in Saudi Arabia, but as I said, that branch is collapsing very quickly. In 2004, it establishes a branch in Iraq after it merges with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group, Al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, and they produce the group Al-Qaeda in the Land of the Two Rivers. This franchise is a disaster for Al-Qaeda. It's not a surprise that this franchise eventually went through the process of becoming the Islamic State of Iraq, and then Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, and eventually now the Islamic State. So we have Al-Qaeda's first two franchising decisions, and they are pretty disastrous. But Al-Qaeda is a learning organization. In 2006, it expands to the Islamic Maghreb, and in 2009, it announces the establishment of a branch in Yemen. This one, again, is a branch that is based on its own people. Part of the learning process is that by that point, Al Qaeda is not eager to advertise that it has new branches. And so Al-Shabaab in Somalia joins Al Qaeda as a branch in 2010, but Al Qaeda doesn't admit that until 2012. Then in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra is established in 2012, but only a year later, when there is a direct conflict between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, that Jabhat al-Nusra announces, we are a branch of Al-Qaeda. And finally, in 2014, Al-Qaeda announces the establishment of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. This happens 2 months after ISIS announces the establishment of its caliphate. And so this seems like a response to that measure. So this is a long history of the franchising, but it's important to note that branching out this way was not an inevitable derivative of Al Qaeda's ideology. There is nothing in the ideology of Al Qaeda that suggests that you need to establish branches. If you're an organization, a terrorist organization that wants to expand, you don't have to establish franchises. You can just expand your network. You can put people in different countries to carry out attacks, the old way of just putting cells in different locations and let them operate. Establishing branches is something else. This is not necessary, and in many ways, this is mainly a political statement, or at least also a political statement. Importantly, this is a risky choice for Al Qaeda, because when you start creating a two-tier system, you are delegating authority to people that you don't really have much control over, especially when you're a transnational movement and your leadership is stuck in the border area of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and your branches are mainly in the Middle East. So when you delegate, you might be able to see your branches operating even when you are under siege in Afghanistan, but you cannot control the branches and make sure that the branches are actually following your instructions the way that you intended to. The problem is even more severe because sometimes the branches have their own agendas. Just look at the Iraqi case and you see that practically from the beginning, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had his own ideas, his own strategy, and that's even before we get to the possibility that different leaders will just have their own self-interest, that different jihadi leaders will want to be the main guy, somebody that will substitute bin Laden as the most famous jihadi, or somebody that will lead the jihadi movement. And finally, the risk is that when you tie yourself to those branches, they can damage your brand name. You are putting your fate in the hands of branches that in some cases you cannot trust. And when they do things that violate your principles or that are against your instructions, it's not going to really help that you will try to tell the world that, well, we didn't really mean to do so. They acted in a way that contradicted our instructions. You just can't come out right from this. So why does Al Qaeda franchise? First, this is a matter of a response to the failure after 9/11. When Al Qaeda carried out the 9/11 attack, it wanted to use that as a way to bring the United States into the Middle East, and hoping that the arrival of the United States to the Middle East will allow Al Qaeda to mobilize the Muslim masses. Al Qaeda understands that it doesn't have the power to achieve its agenda, and therefore it needs a lot of people to join it. Al Qaeda believes that if it attacks the United States, the success will prove to young Muslims that the United States is not invincible, and that individuals will then be attracted to Al Qaeda, especially when they will see that the United States is attacking innocent Muslims, and therefore Al Qaeda believe that this attack will be will be the catalyst for mass mobilization that will allow Al Qaeda to push its agenda. Al Qaeda was surprised and disappointed. It didn't work. Few Muslims supported Al Qaeda. Even among jihadi groups, there were many that were actually very upset. They said, we objected to this operation. You took this operation without consulting us, without announcing it or consulting the Taliban. As a result, not only you led to the collapse of the Taliban regime, you also destroyed our safe haven, and you put a target on our back, because the United States is not very good in distinguishing. Nuances are not really the strongest suit of the United States. And therefore, Al Qaeda just went after anybody that seemed like a jihadi. And so in the years after 9/11, both Al Qaeda and other jihadi groups suffered significant losses. The assessments are that in the first 2 years after 9/11, Al Qaeda lost something like 80% of its manpower. So obviously, the gambit didn't succeed as well as it hoped. Another reason why you want to establish branches is that when you are in trouble, you can use those branches to show that they can act, to operate when you cannot. And even if they are not operating, sometimes just the announcement of that expansion creates an image of success. It creates an image of expansion that Al Qaeda hopes that at least for a while can substitute for attacks. It keeps you in the news. It creates an image that you continue to manage to attract people. And they hope that that success will breed more and more success. And finally, as I noted before, Al Qaeda needed to do something when the United States was heading into Iraq. And since Al Qaeda didn't have the capabilities, it first tried in Saudi Arabia, where it had some capabilities. And then when that didn't work, Al Qaeda tried to reach Iraq. And the way to enter the Iraqi arena was through relationship with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group in Iraq. So let's speak about the relationship between transnationalism and segmentation. Because what we are seeing in the franchising move is segmentation of a transnational movement. Transnational movement like Al Qaeda had ambitions for the whole universe. Al Qaeda hoped at least to bring about change to the Middle East, to go beyond it to all countries where Muslims rule, expand also to countries that once came under Muslim control, such as Spain, for example. Some places you hear references to Rome, Austria, of course, East Timor, Israel. But Al Qaeda wants to go even beyond that. What makes Al Qaeda and the Islamic State so different is that while most jihadi groups before them, and still, try to focus on bringing change in their own country, Al Qaeda and ISIS are trying to overturn the international order. They try to create a world that is based on religion, not on states. But this is not easy to do because we're still living in a state-based order, and the international society has considerable structural power. Just think about it. We call terrorists terrorists because this is what states decided to do. States are those that decide what kind of violence is legitimate and what is not. States are also the gatekeepers to who can become a state. It's really interesting to see how terrorist organizations, because many of them aspire to become part of that international system, many want to become states or to secede from a state and establish their own state, they have incentives to try to moderate their ways so that at a certain point when they're close to success, they can be accepted by the international community. If you do not get recognition from the international community, it's really hard for you to exist. Just look at the difficulties that the Taliban had. The Taliban had an impressive control in Afghanistan. It managed to control Afghanistan probably better than anybody else in the last 100 of years. And yet we call the Taliban, never really referring to it as the government of Afghanistan as it was between 1996 and 2001. And this is because most actors in the international system refuse to accept its legitimacy. And again, remember, the Taliban had much better control over the territory than most of the African states ever had. And nobody's doubting their statehood. So states decide who can be a legitimate state, and being a legitimate state also gives you benefits. Only a state can legitimately wield force. Only a state can use coercive means in a legitimate way. There are some exceptions in international law for people under occupation, but overall, it is states that decide that states only can use violence. We can argue whether this is just or not, but it's not relevant at all. The point is that states have the power. And if you are a group that has political objectives, you need to see how those political objectives fit with the structural power of the international society. If this is a problem for terrorist organizations that are focused on one particular state, you can imagine how much of a problem this is for a transnational group that wants to overturn world order. So this is a really enormous task. Another problem that transnationalism faces is that despite all the efforts that jihadis are making, most Muslims still identify themselves first and foremost with their national identity or with their subnational identities, often tribalism. People do feel strong attachment to their religion, but feeling attachment to your religion doesn't necessarily mean that you see your religion as your first political identity marker. Most of us will identify first and foremost with the country that we live in. Then perhaps in lower levels of identity, but really rarely we think about identifying ourselves with religion as a political entity. And for jihadi groups, the main objective is to identify themselves as Muslims, as part of the Ummah. Their political entity is not supposed to be a regular state. It is supposed to be an Islamic state. An Islamic state is very different. It's not a state that will fit within the international order because it will have maybe follow domestically Sharia law, but internationally it will accept international law and international treaties, and in general, the international society. An Islamic state is a state that focuses on your religion as your primary identity. And when you are a group like Al Qaeda, you want that identity to be transnational. You want that overarching identity. But when people don't follow you, you have a serious problem. And Al Qaeda found again and again that even people that followed it had the inclination to first and foremost identify with their country, seek to bring about change in their own country, and not to go beyond that. And that means that localization efforts, like Al Qaeda does in branching out, in creating franchises, create a tension between Al Qaeda's transnational mission and the operations that are focused locally. Those localized efforts make a big difference. So Al Qaeda has an agenda that wants to change the whole world, but the different branches, first, they're mostly comprised of locals. Right? You could have in a branch in Sinai, for example, a few Saudis. But overall, a branch is going to be primarily based on locals. And locals care more about local objectives, especially the rank and file. Maybe the leadership thinks in strategic terms, but the rank and file often join for other reasons, not necessarily ideology, and when they operate, they want to operate to achieve local objectives. That also means that their targets tend to be local, while Al Qaeda, as a transnational organization, would like all its branches to attack the United States. The branches tend to focus more locally. So here, an effort by Al Qaeda to survive after the failure of 9/11, or the exaggerated success of 9/11 that brought about failure for Al Qaeda, Al Qaeda's effort to survive as a result just brought incoherence to the organization. Now, I argue that we can learn about the future of Al Qaeda and the difficulties that come from the tension between transnationalism and localization if we look at the case of the Muslim Brotherhood. First, it's important to emphasize that there are lots of differences between Al Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. Al Qaeda started as a transnational organization, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood was established in Egypt in 1928, and it was focused first on Egypt. The branching out process, Al Qaeda gave the instructions. It was Al Qaeda that decided to branch out, Al Qaeda Central. In the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, it was often people that came to Egypt, sympathizers that saw what happens in Egypt, were excited about the Muslim Brotherhood and its activities, went back to their home countries and wanted to establish branches of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the direction, the actors that direct here, mostly a bottom-up process as opposed to the top-down process in the case of Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda emphasizes the use of violence. In the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, while they do not reject violence under some circumstances, just look at Hamas, it's a Muslim Brotherhood branch in the Palestinian Authority, and some other Muslim groups, branches of the Muslim Brotherhood that did use violence on occasion. Even the Egyptian branch for a while had a unit that carried out terrorist attacks. But normally the Muslim Brotherhood believes in bringing about change through a societal process, through education, through shaping society so that it will be ready to accept Sharia law. In the case of Al Qaeda, the view was that first of all, we need to use violence to bring about change. There is no other way that it's going to succeed, only violence. And yet, despite those differences, there are also lots of important similarities. Most important is that both of those organizations have to deal with the dilemma of how you square the circle. How do you respond to the incompatibility between the universalism of your objective? The Muslim Brotherhood would like Islam to expand throughout the world as well. And it is a transnational movement with branches in about 70 countries. So both groups have to find a way to respond to that incompatibility between a universal worldview and the fact that the world is divided to nation states, to state actors. So let's speak a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was established in Egypt in 1928. The objective of the Muslim Brotherhood was to remove Western influence. Remember, at that point, Egypt is under British rule. So they want to remove Western influence and they want to implement Islamic law. The main way to achieve that is through a bottom-up societal change. Gradually, the Muslim Brotherhood expanded its agenda and its methods. About 20 years after it was established in Egypt, there are branches coming up in different locations in the Middle East, especially in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Today, the Muslim Brotherhood, as I said, branches in over 70 countries. So this is a really huge movement. And those branches of the Muslim Brotherhood are linked through one organization, the International Organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. So in a way, we can see the International Organization of the Muslim Brotherhood as sort of a parallel to Al Qaeda Central. and the Muslim Brotherhood branches as a parallel to Al Qaeda's branches. In the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, the branches are largely independent. They understood that they developed in a different situation, in different locations, that different countries or different communities have their own ways of achieve their goals that are based on the local conditions. So the branches are very independent. They hardly get any instructions from the core. They are free to operate. They prioritize flexibility so that they can survive even with even at times that the regimes in which of those countries in which they operate suppress them. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to find a way to affect society and trying in most cases not to turn to violence, it is especially important for the Muslim Brotherhood to find a way to reach accommodations with the state so that they can truly operate. And that means that they need to make painful compromises for them. They are engaged in politics, and politics involves compromising. And so the Muslim Brotherhood, from the start, allowed its branches to navigate their own way, to figure out what's the best way for them to advance in their own countries. But that also means that there are lots of differences between those branches. Some of them will create positive relationships with the state, even provide it legitimacy. In other cases, they will focus on bringing about change through trade unions, especially in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood traditionally, since it couldn't really run in elections, tried to gain control over the lawyers' associations, doctors' associations, so that they can have that effect. They differ in the balance that they see between political and social action, again, all according to the circumstances. That ambiguity allows them to survive and allows the Muslim Brotherhood to expand to the point that it can exist in so many locations. And it establishes the Muslim Brotherhood as a big tent movement. But as often happens in a big tent means also that you have people from lots of directions, and the gap between extremes can be significant. In 1982, the Muslim Brotherhood established the International Organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. Until that point, the Egyptian branch was recognized as the primary branch, but it had limited impact. In 1982, there is an effort driven primarily by the branch in Egypt to create an umbrella group, to create a central organization that will be above the different branches. And that new organization tried to codify spheres of responsibility. What is the responsibility of the international organization, and what are the responsibilities of the different branches? Who needs to do what? It created new institutions, a general guide for the whole Muslim Brotherhood, which was usually an Egyptian, a guidance bureau that, again, dominated by the Egyptians, and a Shura Council of 100 members, but again, dominated by the Egyptians. There are disagreements in the literature about why the Muslim Brotherhood decided to go for that international organization. See the date and you remember that Anwar Sadat assassinated in 1981. And so after his assassination, the Egyptian regime is cracking down on anything that smelled of Islam. And they didn't go only after the perpetrators, which were the Gamma Islamiyah and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, but they went after the Muslim Brotherhood as well. So the branch in Egypt is under distress, and it lacks resources. At the same time, there is a significant change in the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe. And this is a really fascinating case. In Islam, there is a common division between Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Islam is the territory that is under Muslim control. Dar al-Harb is the territory that should come under Muslim control. Harb is war, and the way to achieve that is likely going to have to be through violent means. So this is really an important distinction. Now, what happens when you have Muslims in the West? If Dar al-Islam is the Muslim countries, and by the way, for the jihadi groups, even the Muslim countries are not really Dar al-Islam because the regimes are apostates in their minds. But what do you do with Europe? And you have lots of Muslims, lots of members of the Muslim Brotherhood that had to escape their home countries and move to Europe. They are in Europe, which should be Dar al-Harb, but at the same time, if it will be Dar al-Harb, then they cannot operate, since those regimes will crack down on them. Over time, those people in Europe stop seeing themselves just as exiles that will come back to the Middle East and start developing their own agendas. Now they want to care about Muslim communities in the West. They have their own intrinsic agendas. And that means that in order to legitimize them, the Muslim Brotherhood has to make an ideological revision so that they can expand, have another category that will allow them to operate in the West without turning to violence. So Europe is becoming a lot more important for the Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptians are seeking a solution for the problems that they have. And the solution seems to be the establishment of the international organization. But that experiment failed miserably. Instead of helping the Egyptian branch, it just put more burden on it. And it led to anger by other groups, other branches that said that were not pleased with the emphasis on the Egyptian causes or Egyptian issues. At the same time, the European branches are not really interested in being submissive to the Egyptian branch. And finally, there are significant internal conflicts between the different branches. In some ways, it's easier for the jihadi groups. The jihadi groups believe in violence and they see most of the regimes as enemies. But if you're a Muslim Brotherhood type of group, you need to reach accommodation with your regimes. You want to be able to operate. And that means that there is a limit to how much you can go against the positions of your regime, especially when it comes to international affairs. So look at the case of the war in Iraq, the invasion on August 2nd, 1990, of Saddam Hussein to Kuwait, creates a situation where now an Arab state invades and conquers another Arab state. The Muslim Brotherhood in Kuwait were very upset. They wanted to condemn and to act against Iraq. But the Iraqi branch of the Muslim Brotherhood had different preferences, and the Jordanian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Jordanian regime supported Iraq, they had to toe the line and support Iraq as well. So now you have a conflict within the Muslim Brotherhood between the Egyptian branch and the Kuwaiti branch, between the Jordanian branch and the Kuwaiti branch. So this attempt didn't really work. And then comes 9/11 and makes the whole thing a lot worse, because now you don't want to be a transnational movement, because if you're going to seem as a transnational movement pursuing transnational objectives, the United States is not going to be happy about that. You don't want to be identified with any of the jihadi groups, and transnational ideology after 9/11 is very problematic for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood that want to achieve political objectives through nonviolent means and focusing really on making the change through different countries at the same time. The result, as you can see in that quote from Brown, is that the International Organization of the Muslim Brotherhood ended up as no more than a tame framework for a group of loosely linked, ideologically similar movements that recognize each other, swap stories and experiences in occasional meetings, and happily subscribe to a formally international ideology without really giving it much priority. What are the lessons from this case? First, it tells you that we cannot judge the power of a group just by bringing together assessing the power of all the different branches. The cumulative size and the geographical spread are just a poor predictor or insufficient to determine the strength of the organization. A second lesson is that the decentralization of the Muslim Brotherhood meant that the international organization of the Muslim Brotherhood could not control the branches. Decentralization allows you flexibility to operate, but it comes at the expense of control. Furthermore, localization creates those dynamics that further weaken the transnational ties. The result is that an ideology that is transnational gradually falls apart as the main actors are really much more focused on their local agendas. So let's conclude with going back to Al Qaeda. As I said, expansion of the jihadi movement does not correspond to equal strengthening of Al Qaeda. So while we do see jihadis operating in a lot more places than ever before, and even cause a lot of harm. Terrorist attacks are painful, and many countries in Africa and the Middle East are suffering the consequences. But that expansion doesn't necessarily mean that the jihadi movement is as strong as bringing all those forces together. Another conclusion is that transnational agenda is extremely difficult. The response of the international community complicates your ability to aggregate capabilities. It's not easy to cross borders. It's not easy to create effects beyond different locations. And transnational movement wants to create transnational political effects. The other problem is that people are just a lot more attracted to their entrenched national and subnational identities, much stronger than religion as a political identity. Al Qaeda understands that, and it is trying to evade the nationalism trap. It is trying to go beyond nationalist agenda, and they are aware of the risk that the different branches will focus on national agenda instead of the transnational agenda. Al Qaeda speakers repeatedly, especially Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al Qaeda, keep saying, the case of Palestine or in the case of Syria recently, this is not just the battle of Syrians. Syria or Asham, the Levant, is part of the Ummah. This is an issue for all Muslims. Therefore, all Muslims have a right and actually are obligated to participate in helping their Syrian brothers and in turning Syria into a place that is ruled by Sharia. So Al Qaeda is trying to suggest, again, that the religious identity is what's supposed to be the most important part. It is trying to avoid that nationalist trap. In part, it's doing that by expanding regionally. We see that especially in the Sahel, in the Sahara Desert, where Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is trying to expand. But even when it tries to expand regionally, you find that the efforts are often really localized. If you look at the sub-branch in Mali, pretty active branch, uses almost entirely jihadis from Mali, without really any interest or ability to bring about change throughout the region. The main solution for Al Qaeda, of course, is to focus on the United States. But Al Qaeda had to make compromises. So while the jihadis were successful in Syria, Al Qaeda decided to avoid using Syria as a launching pad for attacks on the West. But it's not clear how much ability Al Qaeda actually had it wanted to attack from Syria. Yes, granted, all jihadi actors are capable once in a while carrying out terrorist attacks. And if they can motivate some individuals to carry out lone wolf attacks, that can happen as well. But this is far from any measure that will really promote the political objectives. And we do see that Al Qaeda is simply, despite all the claims that it's focusing on the United States, it's not really doing much. And when it tries, it repeatedly fails, which doesn't mean that it won't succeed once in a while. Again, I want to emphasize that. Even worse for Al Qaeda, when a branch becomes strong and close to success, it just dumps Al Qaeda. We saw that with the Islamic State of Iraq, turning into ISIS, abandoning Al Qaeda. We see that now in Syria, where Jabhat al-Nusra went through a metamorphosis and is now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and it dissociated itself from Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was not happy with that, and interesting debates between leaders of Al Qaeda and leaders of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And it is interesting, especially for observers like us, that they do all those fighting online for us to see, which is just a pleasure. So we see that even in Syria, when the branch Jabhat al-Nusra felt that it can no longer make progress, it knew that it had to distance itself from Al Qaeda. The association with Al Qaeda deterred other groups from getting into alliance with Jabhat al-Nusra. Those actors were afraid that if they will ally with Jabhat al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the United States will go after them. The foreign sponsors will refuse to provide them any more support. So Jabhat al-Nusra tried to dissociate itself from Al Qaeda, hoping that that will save it. It didn't really work, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is now under intensive attack from within, from its former allies in Al Qaeda, and from other Syrian rebel groups, including Islamist groups. But clearly, a strong branch means that soon they're going to face political decisions and will have to escape Al Qaeda. That also means that when we think about the threat of Al Qaeda, maybe we should disaggregate it. Rather than try to look at Al Qaeda Central and all the branches together, we need to understand that it is actually often different kinds of threats in different locations, which also means that you need to tailor different responses in different locations. And most of all, that you should not magnify the threat. And here I'm especially angry at politicians, irresponsible politicians that are trying to score political points, but the result is that they are only, well, first it leads to, if we see Al Qaeda as all of those together, we're not going to allocate resources properly. So this is one danger, and we cannot then fight them effectively. But beyond that, the kind of statements that we hear, especially regarding generalizations about Muslims, are just creating hostility. They're not helping anybody, and they are magnifying the threat. I would say actually that the focus on terrorism leads to terrorism becoming a much more significant threat than it should be. If you're hurt as a result of terrorism, this is a 100% hit. Definitely the individuals that get targeted, there is no way to describe the pain. But when you look from a strategic perspective, if we speak about this as a huge threat, we are lying to ourselves, and we are creating a dynamic that goes against our interests. Because if you look at the evidence, do you know that every year, on average, more Americans get shot by toddlers with guns, little kids with guns, than people die in the United States as a result of terrorist attacks? Not saying again that terrorism is not important. I'm just saying that something about our priorities is completely off. Because the threat, while we need to pay attention and make sure to prevent attacks as much as we can, the threat is not as high, and we are diverting resources from other objectives. My sense is that probably we could use some money for better education. So we need to understand that. We also need to understand that those politicians that emphasize terrorism and that also try to promote Islamophobia are just increasing the threat of terrorism because they lead to alienation of people and putting really Muslims in awkward situation. In many ways, this serves exactly the objective of the Islamic State. The Islamic State had a strategy of erasing the gray area, with the idea is to force Muslims to decide you're either with them or with us. When Muslims, after any kind of terrorist attack, or just for political reasons or interest of politicians, are being singled out, they feel that they are alienated from all sides, and this way, this kind of behavior is only increasing the threat. So my bottom line is that the United States should treat Al Qaeda seriously, but should not inflate the threat and act in a more nuanced and responsible way. We will all benefit from that. And I'm done. Thank you.